Is HEMA the best modern martial art for knife fighting? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, whenever I talk about knives or knife fighting topics, it gets very contentious. Let's try and avoid that for once, okay? So we accept, first of all, getting into knife fights, not recommended at all, extremely dangerous. However, if we look at statistics from around the world, it doesn't matter whether you live in a country where there's lots of guns or where you're able to carry guns around or concealed carry, open carry, whatever. The fact is that knives statistically injure more people around the world than firearms do in civilian environments. And of course they're used in military environments as well. If we go as recently as things like Afghanistan, then knives have been used in close combat. Even bayonets have been fixed on the end of rifles as well by the British Army. But knife or kukri or dagger in hand has been used in a modern military context. So the fact is, whether guns are available or not, knives are still a factor. And the other thing to mention is that for most people in most of the world, carrying a gun or going around with a gun isn't an option. It might be where you live, but it's not in lots of other places. And even if it is an option where you live, statistically, the places I've looked at anyway, statistically, even the places where there are lots of firearms and you can carry firearms, knives are still used an awful lot, unfortunately. So that could cover defense against knives, or it could include the use of knives against other knives, or indeed the use of knives against people who are armed in some other way as well. So the fact is that knives, military and civilian context, still extremely prevalent around the world. So the question naturally follows, which martial arts today are best to look at if you're concerned about either defense against knives or use of knives against other knives or use of knives against other armed opponents in a military context. Now, as I highlighted in a recent video, HEMA has a reputation for being all about sword fighting, but it's not, okay? HEMA includes various types of wrestling styles, boxing styles, unarmed martial arts of all sorts, and goes all the way up to World War II combatives used by British and American commandos and German special forces and all sorts. So it actually covers a massive range. Yes, it goes all the way back into the Middle Ages, and a lot of people focus on things like longsword or sword and buckler, but it covers all sorts of unarmed and knife-armed martial styles as well. Now, the knife is particularly interesting because it really covers the entire period of HEMA that we study. And a lot of people think about just sources and studying historical stuff, but bear in mind, some of this stuff was used in World War I, World War II, and is still being used in modified forms today. It's still evolving, it's still being used. So there is a corpus of material used in military combatives which traces its way all the way back to late 19th century martial arts. And these are very much HEMA, and these are very much some of the things that I study. So we can see the use of knife in the 19th century hasn't changed an awful lot to the modern day. So the question I want you to consider here is, what are the best martial arts for looking at defense against knife and use of the knife against other people with knives or other people with other weapons? Which are the best martial arts that you could study today pertaining to the knife or dagger? Now, before I leap into talking about knife skills, I want to talk about some other skills, particularly the special offer that I've got below for you right here with Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes and members in over 150 countries. The thing which most amazed me when I first joined Skillshare was the number of courses, but also the ones that are specifically applicable to me. Everything to do with marketing and finance through to web design, publicity, YouTubing, how to edit photos and make my photography a lot better on my website. If you've got a specific new skill that you're trying to learn, Skillshare is the perfect place to start, from photography and illustration to graphic design, freelancing and more. Like me, your day-to-day is probably filled with tasks and endless to-do lists. So why don't you prioritize your self-care and wellness by using Skillshare as a way to invest in yourself, unwind and relax. There are literally new classes being launched every week, and the entire catalogue is available with subtitles in Spanish, Portuguese, French and German. I've actually been looking at some yoga exercises here, and this is called Bulletproof Your Body 15-minute daily yoga. That's right, only 15 minutes a day. These classes are on Skillshare. You can check them out right now for free with my link down below. And this is by Abby Carver. I've been particularly focusing on my hip flex and my hamstrings because that's what's been giving me the most trouble post-training, essentially. So I'm essentially just trying to improve my flexibility in those areas specifically. So what am I offering? Well, for the first 1,000 of you, only 1,000 of you, to click the link below, you will get 1 month's free use of Skillshare. Completely free. No ties, as simple as that. The first 1,000 of you to check out that link below, free Skillshare. You can look at everything on there for a month for absolute free. Go and check out that link now. So now let's get back to the skill of the knife. So it's as simple as this. There aren't a huge number of martial arts around today which actually devote much time to the knife at all. When you talk about modern martial arts, the first thing that most people seem to think about is modern MMA, as used in things like UFC, which is an unarmed martial art, one person versus one in a cage, essentially, okay, in a ring. And that is a very particular type of fighting, and not to undermine how awesome that is and how much it's changed how we look at unarmed martial arts and even self-defense and preparation of soldiers and law enforcement and things like that in the modern world, absolutely. However, we have to admit also right from the outset that whilst being a great striker and grappler, learning to fight well on your feet and fight well onto the ground is absolutely fundamental and awesome in general for pretty much all martial arts. Weapons change the game, unfortunately, and you could be an absolutely amazing jiu-jitsu fighter or judo player, whatever, or indeed a kickboxer, boxer, any other type of wrestler. So, clinching, grappling, or striking and kicking, punching and kicking. You could be fantastic at all of those things, but unfortunately, someone who's essentially untrained with a knife is still going to be extremely dangerous to you. Now, caveat before we go on, of course, there are many other considerations to dealing with unarmed defense against a knife. There's questions about running away, there's questions about avoidance, there's questions about using other objects as improvised weapons, and all sorts of those complicated things. But fundamentally, if we're talking about a situation where you can't run away, you're in a room, building, vehicle, or indeed you're defending other people, so you can't run away, you've got to fight, and you're having to defend yourself as best you can against someone with a knife, or indeed, if it in a military context, or in some cases criminal context, where people are using a knife against someone else with a knife, is a completely different kettle of fish. And it has to be accepted that whilst modern MMA might give you a great basis for being an all-round fighter, fundamentally the knife or any other weapon that might be involved, like an axe or a sword or something like that, is going to drastically change how the encounter pans out and change what you want to do and how you fight. So which martial arts today really focus on the use of knives? Well, I'm not going to cover all of them, but the main ones that I'm aware of are, number one, HEMA, which is obviously why I'm talking about it here, because I'm a HEMA practitioner. Number two, Filipino martial arts, most famously. There's different lineages and traditions, and some of them focus on different types of knife and short sword. But bringing it under one kind of umbrella, let's call it Filipino martial arts, okay? So we've got HEMA, European martial arts, we've got Filipino martial arts. To some extent, we've got certain Japanese martial arts, okay? So within certain aspects of jiu-jitsu or bujinkan or kenjutsu, you might look at the use of knives or defense against knives, and aikido as well, use of knives, but often the defense against a knife, okay? But actually using the knives, as far as I've seen, there isn't a huge amount of it done in Japanese martial arts. There is some, but not a huge amount. And yes, there are some schools that focus on the use of the tanto, for example. However, they're not very mainstream, they're fairly small, and they tend not to cross-train with people outside of their own tradition. They tend to have fixed forms, and they, as far as I've seen, they tend not to spar with people from other backgrounds. We've also got some unofficial martial arts. So there is, in the Caribbean, for example, and parts of South America, there are traditions of machete fighting and other large knife fighting still living today. Okay. Equally, if we go to southern Italy, specifically Sicily and around Naples as well, there are some living traditions of knife use, although broadly speaking, we would say that they are forms of HEMA. They are living traditions that go back some way into the use of the dagger, particularly in southern Italy. And that can also be said of certain other traditions of knife that you might find in isolated areas of South America and the Spanish-speaking world. And then finally, what I'd consider as a slightly separate category is military combatives. Now, this is kind of complicated because military combatives are always evolving, but they draw upon all of the aforementioned sources. So if, for example, we look at World War II, Fairbairn-Sykes dagger type use, they specifically take some of their unarmed combat from jiu-jitsu. However, they also take it from things like Western boxing as well. And there's the elephant in the room that a lot of what you find in jiu-jitsu you can also find in HEMA, because they were doing the exact same or very, very similar techniques within HEMA traditions as well. So broadly speaking, you could say that World War II combatives brought in some historical stuff and different ethnographic stuff. So it brought in some European stuff from the past, it brought in some Japanese stuff from the past, it brought in current European and Japanese training as well, in some cases Chinese and later on Filipino martial arts as well, post-war period. And then in addition, it brought in completely newly invented stuff. So Fairbairn, for example, essentially created his own knife use system. So we do have some things that you don't necessarily attribute specifically to traditional Japanese martial arts or traditional European or Chinese or Filipino martial arts, because they're new inventions. However, none of these things usually are created in a vacuum or in a bubble. They usually come out of experience and exposure to what's around you. Okay, so in that sense, you can just say they're a product of the modern world and all of the influences that we are subjected to. Now, the next thing I'd say about knife defense systems and knife use systems, and those are sometimes different things, sometimes they're intermingled things. I would say generally in a complete system, they should be somewhat intermingled, because you need to know one to sort of be effective at the other a lot of the time, although there are some fencing systems which have just looked at the use of a dagger against another dagger, and I'd say that's not a bad thing to do. There's a lot to be learned from fencing and applied to the use of knives and daggers. But the other thing to say is that, and I've alluded to this already, a lot of what you find in one tradition you'll also find in another tradition. So quite simply, if you've got the exact same technique in a traditional jiu-jitsu school in Japan as you will find in a 16th century wrestling tradition from Germany, where do you say that that thing comes from? It's just something that works, isn't it? So I think attributing it to one or the other is pointless, because, I mean, you might have learned it from the Japanese school, you might have learned it from the German school, but if they're the same, it's the end result that matters, okay? And that's really the combatives mindset, I think. They just take what works and throw away everything else. And bear in mind that something that might have worked historically with a particular weapon or in particular clothing or armour or particular type of fighting environment might not work now. So sometimes it's not that that's necessarily rubbish, it's just that that doesn't make sense in the context that we now find ourselves in. Okay, so in a modern context, be it military, civilian, self-defense, protection, bodyguarding, all the different contexts you can have in the modern world, you might find that each of those contexts want different repertoire, and they do, different repertoire to each other. What you teach a policeman is not the same as you teach a soldier, and it's not the same as you teach a close protection bodyguard necessarily. They're different repertoire. And equally, those might have a different context to someone who was a mercenary in 16th century Italy. Okay, they're different contexts. So what techniques and what weapons make sense there might be slightly different to here. Should be kind of obvious, okay? So, coming back to the original question, how would I analyse what I think the best martial arts to look at knife use and knife defence are? Well, I think there are three main ones, okay, without beating around the bush. I think there are HEMA, there is Filipino martial arts, and then there's what I would call military combatives, which you could also bring in things like Krav Maga and things like that into. So modern self-defense, self-protection systems, which draw upon sometimes those other two, or have just come to the same conclusions by a convergent evolution as the other two. Okay, now, how would I decide between those three things? Well, quite frankly, it's often down to taste. It's often down to finding an instructor and a class that you like, proximity to the classes, can you get to them, that kind of stuff, and what your end goal is. Is your end goal to learn something cultural and interesting like that, or is it simply pure effectiveness because that might be your job? You might be a policeman or a soldier. You might be someone who's training to become security or something like that, someone who's just working the doors of nightclubs or whatever. So there might be entirely different contexts and which will lead you to different things. But what I would say is, when analysing an individual school or style, have a look at how much time they spend on the mats training with those implements or against those implements. So how much time does a given tradition spend training realistic defense or countermeasures to knives, or using knives against knives, or using knives against people with other weapons? Now, when we look at it from that perspective, I believe that that's why those are the three main approaches you should go for: either HEMA, Filipino martial arts, or modern combatives military training. Because those, as far as I have seen throughout my years of martial arts sort of experience and training and meeting people and cross-training with different groups, those are the three, as far as I see it, that use these weapons in hand or fight against these weapons the most often, spend the most amount of time training that, and have the depth and breadth of repertoire to draw upon. They are the most interdisciplinary, as far as I have seen, and they come at it from the most different angles, the most variety of techniques, the kind of broadest perspective and open-mindedness of approach. Okay. Some other martial arts don't do anything with knives. Okay, that's not to say they're bad martial arts, but most kung fu styles, for example, just don't really do anything with knives unless they happen to do something with butterfly knives or something like that, very specific weapon set. Most people training kung fu that I've ever known, and I used to train kung fu, never did anything with knives and don't really know anything practical about using knives or knife defense. Okay. Equally, we could go to lots of the traditional unarmed martial arts, whether it's taekwondo or karate or aikido or whatever. Most of them never really train what I would call effective knife defense techniques, and equally they don't really use knives in those martial arts. Okay, so my belief is that the three martial arts you want to be looking at, and you can combine all of them. You can train all of them and then end up, just narrowing down to whichever one you prefer, or keep training with all of them. I would say the three to look at are HEMA, and if you're interested in knives, find a school that does a lot of stuff with knives. A lot of them won't, they'll just do sword stuff, but find a club that actually does stuff with knives and daggers. And bear in mind the context might be different for different types of knives, different types of dagger, historical period, clothing, so on and so forth. So HEMA, Filipino martial arts, actually the same thing goes as I just said for HEMA. Bear in mind that Filipino knives and daggers come in very specific varieties and are used in a specific context against the historical and cultural clothing and place that Filipino knives were used. So there is lots of cutting and slashing, for example, that will be useless against someone wearing heavy winter clothing in Northern Europe, for example. Okay, and the third one is military combatives, things like Krav Maga, but equally actually looking at World War II training and everything that's come since then. Okay, and very often they will draw upon to different balances. They will draw upon HEMA or they'll draw upon Filipino martial arts. They'll mix them all together, and sometimes they'll introduce new stuff as well, like Fairbairn himself did from his own experience working in Shanghai in the 20s, I think 1920s. And that stuff still followed today. And equally, if you look at how the Gurkhas train today with kukris, it's kind of a modern invention. Yes, it does have some basis in tradition, but if you look at the ways that kukris are being described, being used in the 19th century, it's somewhat different to what they're now training in the British and Indian armies with the Gurkhas, with their kukris. But nevertheless, that is a modern martial art, and that's what they're teaching them to do with their kukris in a modern fighting context. So I hope this has been thought-provoking and interesting. Obviously, I am biased towards HEMA because I do HEMA and I've got an interest in knives. I'm particularly interested in Bowie knife systems, but I teach rondel dagger as well, and they're completely different, okay? And there are some things with rondel dagger systems I would never do with the Bowie knife. Equally, there are some things I do with the Bowie knife I'd never do with the rondel dagger. Probably they're different weapons, different time period, and so on and so forth. And clearly, if you're talking specifically about HEMA, the later you get in time, the closer it gets to a modern context. So Spanish-speaking world Navaja knife fighting, or indeed Bowie knife fighting, is more close to what we see today. However, very, very different to World War II dagger use with the Fairbairn Sykes commando dagger, for example. Different type of context, okay? So, yeah, HEMA, Filipino martial arts, I've got a massive amount of time for, and equally I have for modern combatives as well, military systems that are actually pressure tested and intended to be used in the modern world. I hope that's been somewhat interesting, and you know, if you massively disagree, that's fine. Everyone's welcome to disagree here. We've got freedom of speech. You can post below. And I hope this has been thought-provoking and given my perspective on this topic. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. I'm Matt Easton, and I will be next time as well. See you soon, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.